The New York mayoral race gets even worse for voters hoping for an alternative to socialism as Zohran Mamdani pulls way ahead in the polling. Andrew Cuomo starts attacking him as a rich guy, and new corruption accusations land on former advisors to the incumbent Mayor Eric Adams.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Mene Ukwe-Barua. The man who promises to raise taxes in New York and open government-run grocery stores is now by far the polling favorite. That's Socialist candidate and Democratic nominee Zohran Mamdani. One recent poll has him at about 42%, leading former Governor Andrew Cuomo with 23%, Republican nominee Curtis Sliwa with about 16.5%, and then Eric Adams in fourth with about 9%. There's still a ways to go until November, probably some debates in there, but an interesting new line of attack here from Andrew Cuomo. Here he is on social media recently. Somewhere last night in New York City, a single mother and her children slept at a homeless shelter because you, Assemblyman Zohran Mamdani, are occupying her rent-controlled apartment. Cuomo went on to say that Mamdani grew up rich, married an even wealthier woman. You make $142,000 a year plus stipends, and your wife works too, meaning you together likely make well over $200,000. No matter which way you cut it, Zohran Mamdani is a rich person. He went on to call on Mamdani to immediately move out of his apartment. This is a theme that is now being picked up by other candidates. Here is Eric Adams on New York One.
There's a level of hypocrisy when you want to state that you are for those who are low-income New Yorkers, but you occupy spaces that low-income New Yorkers have. And I think that's wrong. If you're going to voice a belief, you should live that belief.
That's right.
I believe low-income New Yorkers should get as much support as possible, and I'm doing that in my personal capacity, and I've done it in my professional capacity.
Kim, what do you make of this as a line of attack on the front runner? Do you think there's some political gains to be had here for Cuomo or Adams?
The thing that I think most people should note is Cuomo's definition of the rich and be very, very scared. At least he's being honest, right? A lot of people out there, when you hear Bernie Sanders talking about the rich, you assume that he's talking about those millionaires and billionaires. But no, according to Andrew Cuomo, now if you earn $200,000 as a two-earner income home, you qualify as rich. But this is amusing at so many levels, Kyle. First of all, Mamdani is a public servant. He earns, as you read out, about $142,000 a year. Even with his wife's income, if it's $200,000 a year, most people understand that's about what two public servants make, and it doesn't get you very far in an expensive city. In fact, most people would just call that solidly middle class. But also the joke of Andrew Cuomo making this allegation. This is his father was the former governor. He was married to Kerry Kennedy. He currently rents an $8,000 a month non-rent controlled apartment in New York. And I get it. He's arguing that well, look, I'm in a non-rent controlled apartment and you, Mamdani, should be as well, too. But there are other ironies here in that one of the reasons that we are in this situation in New York is that because of a law Andrew Cuomo signed and that essentially has continued to allow folks like Mamdani to live in rent controlled apartments. And we can jump into that. But as a political attack, this seems destined to not go very, very far. Mamdani basically said this proposal is going to cause massive displacement. And why? Because, this guy wants to deflect from the real issues. It's clearly not hurting Mamdani in the polls, but I do think it tees up Cuomo as looking like he's changing his position given his past legislation, and also a little bit desperate, not to mention the things they're saying probably just won't make a lot of sense to many New Yorkers.
I would second that. I don't know the exact numbers, but I would imagine that there are some people also living in New York, maybe living in rent-stabilized apartments, maybe making about what Zohran Mamdani and his family, his wife, probably make. and thinking to themselves, wait a second, is Andrew Cuomo coming after me now? And even that's aside from the ironies that Kim highlights. One of them is Andrew Cuomo is nobody's definition of the little guy. There's a Politico story that says that he made more than $500,000 last year from his legal consulting firm. He had a net worth somewhere around $10 million at the beginning of his final year in office, including some big money that he got to write that memoir about COVID. And then, two, the fact that Andrew Cuomo signed a law that relaxed the rent stabilization rules. It used to be before 2011 that apartments could be deregulated, the rents of them could be deregulated if household income rose above $175,000. That provision was eliminated by Governor Andrew Cuomo. Meantime, Monet, the campaign of Mayor Eric Adams having a bad week. A couple of new corruption accusations against former aides to the mayor. On Thursday, there was an indictment from the Manhattan District Attorney of Ingrid Lewis Martin, charging her with bribery. She has pleaded not guilty. Here is part of what she said earlier this week.
I have never taken any gifts, money, anything. I have not made any arrangements in advance to take any gifts or money, or to have any gifts or money given to a family member or a friend in order for me to do my job.
Monet, you've looked at this indictment from Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg. What does it accuse Lewis Martin of doing?
Well, first, I want to start by noting that listeners outside of New York City will probably be most familiar with Alvin Bragg for the charges he brought against Donald Trump, which included some of the most bizarre, tortured, complicated, difficult to understand charges ever brought against a public figure. The charges against Ingrid Lewis Martin are the exact opposite of that. They are very clear, classic, old school corruption from someone who was working in City Hall as an advisor to Eric Adams. She basically is accused over the course of about 3 years of accepting bribes for a bunch of different favors, most of which had to do with things like speeding up approvals. So, for example, there was a developer of a karaoke bar, of all things, in New York City who paid her a certain amount, and she was able to push through the approvals for that to get it off the ground. Of course, it often takes years and years for these sorts of projects to be approved. And so she basically used her influence inside City Hall to make sure that that got done. But there are also more sinister accusations in the indictment as well. One is that she basically was steering contracts that the city was giving to people who were trying to get their properties used as shelters for asylum seekers. So during the big migration wave of a lot of people coming to New York City, being bused to New York City, and the city being unable to find places to shelter these individuals, Ingrid Lewis Martin was basically helping people who are trying to say, okay, I'm going to line my property up to get paid by the city for the purpose of sheltering these folks. And so there were many, many different allegations of this kind, but they mostly all fit in that category of accepting bribes. And it's another black mark on the Eric Adams administration, which has had many, many charges of this kind, including against Eric Adams himself.
Then another strange incident this week. After a Wednesday campaign event in Harlem, a news reporter for an outlet called The City said that she was given cash money in an opened bag of hers potato chips, sour cream and onion for the record, Ripple potato chips, by a former aide to Mayor Eric Adams, Winnie Greco. Greco then denied that there was any nefarious intent at that. The reporter tried to give the money back at some point. A lawyer for Greco says this: I assure you that Winnie's intent was purely innocent. In the Chinese culture, money is often given to others in a gesture of friendship and gratitude, unquote. Let's listen to a clip of Greco cornered by a reporter for the New York Post.
And somebody tried to hurt me. I cannot say nothing. Before, I didn't know how much is in my envelope because this is my birthday gift. That's Chinese culture. So I put it.
Your birthday gift?
That's somebody giving me my birthday gift. So I bit mistake. I'm so sorry.
So
I cannot say
said,
nothing.
yeah. So did you say that Katie Coleman was trying to hurt you?
Yes.
The city news site reports that federal prosecutors then came and got the chip bag and the red envelope and the cash. We don't know exactly how much was inside, Kim, but it was at least 100 and some 20s. What the heck?
Well, before I get to Winnie Greco, I would just like to say for the record that few things do I enjoy doing more than karaoke. So while I take a dim view of bribery, I am all for speedier approval of karaoke bars. Um, So this Winnie Greco story is just bizarre. And if anyone has not gone and read the account of it in this news outlet called The City, which housed the reporter that was the recipient of this money, I do urge you to go do it, because stuff is just better than fiction. And you heard that excuse right there. There was an argument on behalf of Greco. This somehow is tied up in Chinese culture and gestures of friendship and gratitude. But I think the background information is also important here too. There are other allegations that have stood against Greco. It was alleged that she turned a free event at the mayor's mansion in 2022 into a fundraiser for her nonprofits, asking $10,000 donations to attend. The FBI reportedly raided her homes, and she resigned from City Hall in October. I think the bigger point here is that these two events coming at the same time just add to this swirl that has been around Eric Adams. And, he is still reeling to a certain extent from the cloud that was passed over him when there were charges brought against him by federal prosecutors that he somehow took gifts from Turkish interests. By the way, I should note that he has denied any wrongdoing. All of the people that we've just mentioned have denied wrongdoing. Trump prosecutors did drop those charges, so he no longer faces that immediate prosecution threat. But that has in turn led to claims that he escaped, and those charges were dropped only because he offered to help the president with deportations. And that hasn't set well with voters either. And this is why, if you look out, he is polling a clear fourth. A Gotham polling analysis from August 11th had him with 8.8%, Mamdani with 42%, Cuomo with 23, and Sliwa with 16. Sliwa was the Republican candidate. So, I mean, this is just adding to the air that Adams has too many bags that he's dragging behind him to be reelected, and this is not going to help at all.
Let's listen to some of the candidates taking up that point. Here is Cuomo, then Sliwa, then Mamdani.
This makes it a mockery. It plays to the worst impression that you could have.
He surrounds himself with cronies who are corrupt. This will probably finally end any hopes he has for re-election.
What you're seeing is a mayor who has surrounded himself with people who've made these kinds of decisions again and again and again. And if you look at DA Alvin Bragg's case, he lays out very clearly that this is a city for sale.
To underline the point that Kim made a moment ago, Adams denied any wrongdoing in those federal charges against him. His former chief advisor, who was indicted this week, has pled not guilty to those charges and denies wrongdoing. Winnie Greco denies any wrongdoing. There has been at least one guilty plea. Adams's former chief Muslim liaison this month pleaded guilty to wire fraud conspiracy. But Monet, it does raise, I think, the question in voters' minds of who is Eric Adams surrounding himself with. And one other thing that it bears mentioning here is those charges against Adam were dropped again over the objection of the acting U.S. attorney in Manhattan, who resigned in protest when the Trump administration moved to drop that case against Adams. And I think that also is part of what is not helping him in a blue city. The perception, which again Eric Adams also denies, but the perception that Adams escaped this prosecution because he made some sort of kind of tacit, implicit agreement with the Trump administration that they would let him off, and maybe he could be more helpful with the White House's deportation agenda.
Yeah, I think you raise an interesting question about what type of person Eric Adams surrounds himself with. And Eric Adams came very much out of a deep New York City political culture. He was a police officer for many years before being a member of the state Senate, and then ultimately Brooklyn borough president before becoming mayor. And a lot of the people around him are people with whom he was personally associated for years. Many of whom hadn't actually held any kind of political office or didn't come out of the policy world. They were just associates of his, had volunteered on his campaigns, and had helped raise money for him, who then were brought into these top-ranking jobs in City Hall. And so I think that a lot of them probably saw, this is my shot, essentially. They were very quickly parachuted, or skyrocketed rather, to the upper strata of power and influence, and many of them seemed to have taken advantage of it. And you can draw a really stark contrast with someone like Mike Bloomberg, for example, who came out of Wall Street, is not actually a native New Yorker, very much was deeply surrounded with people, who, policy professionals, and ran City Hall very much like a well-oiled policy shop rather than promoting a lot of people kind of from the ground level in New York City. So very different flavor of New York City mayor. Probably has some upsides in terms of retail politics, connecting with people in the outer boroughs and things like that. But we might be seeing some of the downsides of it. But the question of Eric Adams and Donald Trump and how that might be explaining why he's performing so dismally in the polls, I think that's certainly the case, that it seemed very much like Adams was posturing for relief from the Trump administration before and after Trump was elected. He was increasing the rate at which he was saying very friendly things about Donald Trump and criticizing Joe Biden. Not that there weren't very valid reasons to do both of those things, given how much New York had struggled under the weight of all these migrants being sent to the city, et cetera. But it did seem as if Eric Adams knew, I'm in legal trouble. Trump is going to be in a position to give me some help. He knows what it's like to be prosecuted unjustly, and maybe he's going to be an ally in this. And that seemed to have paid off for Eric Adams in some of the cooperation that he offered to the Trump administration after he was charged. But I do think that ultimately the bigger thing that's actually dragging down Eric Adams is the migrant crisis itself. The fact that New York City budget was strained by these hundreds of thousands of migrants coming to the city. And Eric Adams seemed to be out of his depth in his ability to marshal any kind of resources and prevent that from spilling into the streets and affecting city life. So there was just a picture of a city that was out of control. Eric Adams was the sitting mayor during it. And I think people have tagged him with the responsibility for that chaos.
Speaking of President Trump and strange political bedfellows, Andrew Cuomo apparently seems to think that he is now going to be getting some help in this campaign from President Trump. Cuomo has publicly said that he would decline a Trump endorsement. He has denied reports that he had spoken with President Trump. But Politico obtained a clip of Cuomo, a recording of Cuomo speaking at a fundraiser last weekend in the Hamptons. And he suggested to the audience there that Trump will ultimately tell Republicans not to vote for the Republican candidate, Curtis Sliwa. Here's the Cuomo quote: Trump himself, as well as other top Republicans, will say the goal is to stop Mamdani, and you'll be wasting your vote on Sliwa. So I feel good about that, unquote. Kim, what do you make of that? Interesting to hear that Cuomo is saying that, but I'm not so sure that the White House would not love to have a Mayor Mamdani to use as a foil for the rest of its time in office.
Yeah, when I heard that and read that, my first thought was that's a lot of wishful thinking on Cuomo's part. This is, I think, a Republican dream. They're enjoying watching this at the moment, especially the twisting among Democrats about as they try to decide what direction to take their party. And there was beginning to be some very serious discussion about this. And then boom, suddenly Mamdani's on the scene and all the focus is once again on crazy progressives, socialist in this particular category. I'd also note that if this is the best that Andrew Cuomo has going for him, hoping that Donald Trump tells Republicans not to vote for the Republican candidate so that maybe possibly this is the only shot he has to get to victory, is not much of a running platform. And this has been my argument all along. People are looking at Mamdani and talking about what a force he is. I would argue that the significant portion of the lead that you see him having right now comes almost entirely down to the function of the incredibly poor competitors he has in this race. And if you're a New Yorker, you're looking at Eric Adams, if you have a candidate who's asking for re-election, you had to have shown real progress in the city, something that you can point to. He can't really. And Monet makes a good point that he was beleaguered by a Biden administration that handed him a big migrant problem. But regardless, he seemed to be out of his depth. And New Yorkers look around, they don't necessarily see the homeless problem better, the crime problem better, daily living costs any better. And so they look at him and says, what do you have to give me now? Cuomo, too, let's not forget, he was whooped in the primary for good reason, because this was a guy who was drummed out of office on sexual allegations and has a very bad taste in the mouths of many New Yorkers, given his ultimate handling of COVID and everything that happened with nursing homes and lockdowns. He doesn't have a great platform. I appreciate he's desperate to break back in New York politics, but, sometimes it's just time to leave. And I think that is, and then Republicans, Curtis Sliwa, there aren't many Republicans to go voting for Curtis Sliwa in this election. So Mamdani's been given a bit of a clearer field that way. And I'm not certain that as many people who are looking at his proposals and in depth and what that might mean in the socialist label, as much as they're looking at a younger, newer face who's promising something different than what's going on in New York right now.
To Kim's point, I'll reverse the poll number we cited at the top. If Mamdani has 42% of the vote, roughly, that means that 58% is for somebody else. But the problem, Monet, is that they are split between these candidates with real flaws and, in some cases, baggage. And there's a coordination problem in that none of them seem to have any inclination or incentive to drop out. And there was ranked choice voting in the Democratic primary for mayor in New York, but there is not ranked choice voting on the November ballot. So 40%, if that's a plurality, is enough to give Mamdani the victory if these other three candidates keep squabbling among themselves and making political attacks on him as a rich guy instead of really going after the stuff that Kim talks about, his policy proposals, his socialism, what that would actually do to New York City. And Monet will give you the last word today.
Yeah, it's a very bleak breakdown. I think that it's interesting to look, for example, at the share of Republican voters in New York City running head to head against Eric Adams in 2021. Curtis Sliwa was able to get about 27% of the vote, which is pretty impressive in a city as blue as New York. But it seems as if there are a lot of Republican voters for whom the question might be posed to them, shouldn't you be voting strategically? Shouldn't you throw your support behind one of the candidates who has a better chance of potentially beating Mamdani and stopping some of these far out left policies? But frankly, a lot of them, I think, just think, I have no reason to vote for a Democrat of any kind. I have seen New York languish under Eric Adams' leadership. And as Kim mentioned, he's failed to tackle the crime problems and other problems that he was elected to do. We've seen the governorship of Andrew Cuomo and the COVID lockdowns. I would rather essentially take a position, a values vote and show how much support there is for essentially a protest candidate in Curtis Sliwa than actually support any of these alternatives. And then we've spent the entire episode going over the ways that Adams and Cuomo, already beginning from somewhat weak and tarnished positions. So it seems as if Cuomo and Adams have both already dug themselves even deeper beyond where they had started from, which was tarnished reputations. And so among these three alternatives to Mamdani, he is actually gaining in vote share. It seems as if people have the sense that the attacks on his positions Voters are already familiar with his positions. They're trying to do new things to drag him down, but so far it doesn't seem to be catching on. And so it seems as if he's coasting his way to potentially being elected unless something happens to shake up the race.
Thank you, Monet and Kim. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.